So my name is Mark Liebig. I'm a research soil scientist with USDA ARS in Mandan. The life of a research scientist is pretty diverse, actually. Yeah. So there's certainly a time in the office. I mean, our job is to publish research, and so there's time writing and analyzing data and thinking it over and interacting with collaborators on the phone. But we also have a pretty active field component and lab components as well. And so it's quite seasonal, as you might expect for our type of work in agriculture. So typically from about late March through November, we spend a lot of our time outdoors. Not all that different than farmers. Oh well, the whole reason we're doing this is in service for farmers and ranchers in the region. That's really our core mission, is to work to create sustainable systems for this region, and we do it from the perspective of looking at not only just the production part of it, which is absolutely critical, the economics, but also looking at other services that we can derive from agricultural landscapes. And so we look at both the agronomic, environmental, and economic. Yeah. So well. If things go to plan, I'm going to talk about diversity and aspects of diversity in agricultural lands. And so it's, as I thought about what to talk about, I took one of the 5 soil health principles that they have at the Minokan farm, and diversity is one of those. And I pick it apart and explain kind of what it is and how we define it in an agricultural setting. And then I'm going to kind of go through and set some examples on how we can use diversity to really regenerate our soils. So we're going to start at the microbial level, and then we're going to finish up at the landscape level. Well, describing diversity as diverse. I mean, there's different ways to really look at it, but in an agricultural setting, we're talking about the biological diversity, the social diversity, and also the economic diversity. This morning I'm going to focus kind of on the biological diversity because as a soil scientist, that's what I know most about. And so it differs depending upon what spatial scale you're going to talk about. What's going on microbially can have a big impact on what's happening within the entire rooting zone, and what's happening in the entire rooting zone can influence what's going on in the fields, and so forth. So you can see they're all really interrelated in space, and also they're interrelated in time. So it's not really much of a crash course. You're going to have to kind of wait for the 45-minute talk, I guess, and then come to the end, I guess. It would be that we have a shared responsibility to create a more sustainable agriculture. I think we're all in this together. We got some pretty big challenges ahead. We've got a lot of good tools at our disposal. It's a matter of utilizing them in an appropriate local context to keep focused on that big picture, which is to create a more sustainable agriculture. Yeah, well, I mean, we all eat, right? And we all want to have the capacity to continue to provide services from agricultural lands in the future. And so, we have to design systems that can meet the needs of today without compromising the needs of tomorrow. And that's where I think the whole theme of the conference here on soil health is really important, because that really gets to a key component of it. I mean, agriculture and soil, they're so strongly interrelated, and you got to really take care of that resource in order to ensure you have what you need from agriculture, which is, of course, feed, fuel, fiber, so forth, but also a number of different key services that we get from our agricultural landscapes. Cycling nutrients, storing organic matter, protecting water quality. We can do that with the right types of systems out there. Okay, regeneration through diversity. So, when Jay invited me to give this talk, he kind of framed it in the context that I would be the academic presentation, which I think is code for the good stuff will come after I'm done. And I don't deny that. We got some great speakers. There will be times over the next roughly 45 minutes, it's probably going to seem a little like a lecture, but there's just one aspect of the 5 soil health principles that the Minokan Farms has that I wanted to drill down on. And those 5, there's soil armor, there's minimize your disturbance, there's a living root, there's livestock integration,
And then there's plant diversity, and I've kind of taken it to address diversity more broadly, because diversity is one thing that I think cuts across a number of different things in agriculture: the enterprises, the crops, the livestock, how we manage. I mean, there's diversity in that. And so I thought we'd drill down a little bit and talk about that in detail. So I'm going to initially just say, you know, the first part of this is a bit of a lecture, or just what are we talking about here? And then most of the talk, I'm going to kind of step through what diversity looks like at different spatial scales in agriculture. And my apologies to the livestock folks in here, but most of my background is in crops, and so I'm going to rely heavily on you know, the examples towards the crop side, but they would apply equally to livestock as well. And in fact, the soil part is, you know, it's systemic; it applies to both. And finally, I got a few slides at the end. We'll talk about the challenges ahead. And I think, Rocky, you've already kind of addressed what we face as a community. So diversity. You know, if you would have asked me to give this talk 10 years ago, I said, oh, well, it's the number of seeds you got in the seed box when you're going to go do your cover crops, right? That was it, without really even thinking about the word and what it means, you know. But it's the word diversity and diversification, it has so many different uses. I mean, it can link to habitat loss. It can link to your portfolio, and your financial portfolio. You know, you want it to be diversified. It can refer to different cultures, or it can refer to agriculture, right? The last one. And diversity in one aspect may not necessarily support diversity in another. In other words, you could have a diverse financial portfolio in your 401k. That means absolutely nothing about how the land's managed, right? So they don't necessarily reaffirm each other. So it's a tricky word. But in agriculture, we're focused on, you know, this is what our focus is in agriculture. And even within agriculture, diversity has different components. There's a biological component that has genetic, structural, and functional subcomponents to that. There's economic component, so you can have a diversity in enterprises, income class, or the degree or strength of connections of those attributes. And then you can also have social diversity, demographics, the level of experience, and the connection of those attributes as well. So it's really complex when you start looking at it. Now, we're going to focus mostly on biological, at least for my talk, because I don't know a lot about economics and social science. But even within the biological attributes, it differs. There are some spatial components to this. You can talk about the diversity of the soil bed and microbial organisms that are within that soil bed, and then go up all the way to the level of the world, because everything would differ. What metrics we would choose at each spatial scale would differ. And to add more complexity to this is that they're interrelated. One is dependent upon the other. The functions within one will influence the other, and vice versa. So it's complex spatially. Time, yeah, there's diversity in time. Every operation that we have out on our farm, it's very unique. There will not be another one like it. Every planting season, every harvest season is different. The growing seasons differ, and so on and so forth. The factors that influence these, as you go on with time, then sort of social changes affect the diversity of our farm space, the cultural changes, and so forth. So it's a really tricky thing to get your hands around. It's tough, but scientists do have ways of quantifying this. And as I'm not an ecologist, and I got into preparing for this talk, and what you find is that there's a tremendous diversity in the ways to quantify diversity. As you might expect, scientists have ways of sort of picking things apart. But I'm just going to touch upon two relatively simple approaches here. The first, over here on your left, is dealing with the number or the proportion of elements within a system. So in this case, the number of elements, we've got, 3, 6, 9, but the proportion aren't the same. Right? We've got more of the yellows, a couple of the blues. So it's like, yeah, it's unique. And also you can have the complexity and the strength of the interactions can differ among the elements as well. And that's something I'm not going to touch upon at all. But for this first part, I'll show you an example. Now, when we talk about the unique elements in the system, the ecologists call that the richness. Okay, so just like counting up the different things, like in that seed box I show you, we had 7 different types of seeds. All right, but were they all in the same proportion? No, and that's why you need to have something called evenness that addresses the relative abundance of each component within the system. Now, to demonstrate, I'm not going to talk about the equation. To demonstrate, we got county A and county B. Their richness is exactly the same. They have all 7 crops represented within that county. But one is a lot more diverse than the other. And why is the case? It's because one has a much higher proportion of cover crops, of alfalfa, of winter wheat, sunflower, than the others. You can see county B is pretty much focused on corn and soybean production. And so that evenness number is different. All right, so we sort of dipped our toes into quantifying diversity. We're done with this lecture, all right? For today, we want to know, well, so what? What does this mean? You know, in what instances diversity have actually relevance in terms of how our agroecosystems function? And secondly, how can we diversify our systems so that they become more sustainable? Now, I'm going to kind of mostly address the first bullet. I'll kind of touch a little bit upon the second, but I think our other speakers are going to be touching on that second a fair bit. So let's start. We're going to start small. We're going to start with microbial diversity. One thing you learn is that it's incredibly complex. Now this paper, and now that they've got this new method to quantify the RNA, the ribosomal RNA, they can measure all the different types of microbes in the soil. And so from this paper from Roche, I weighed out a gram of soil this morning. And you're looking upwards at a minimum 2,000 different types of bacteria. Now you can have up to 1 billion microorganisms in 1 gram of soil, but the diversity in just the bacterial community is immense. It's incredible. And it does so many different functions. I mean, it's amazing how critical that community is and why it's so important to really to harbor and preserve the biological community. And there are aspects of the biological community that we are discovering that are so critically important for the future. Washington Post, about 3 years back, my wife forwarded me this report from about finding new antibiotics to address the superbug issue. I mean, we've got bugs out there that are resistant to multiple rounds of really strong antibiotics. Where are we going to find the next set of medicines? It's probably going to come from the soil. Hopefully not Central Park. I think we could probably do a little better. Or maybe Central Park could be good and they're really resistant to a lot of stuff. I don't know. Yeah, they've seen a lot. The other thing to keep in mind on this diversity thing is that their functions, everything's interrelated, right? Okay? Because everybody's eating somebody else. Rocky, you mentioned the food web. Okay, that means somebody's surviving at the expense of someone else, and that affects the diversity as well. So it's highly interrelated, highly complex. And it is definitely tops among categories in sort of the living sort of kingdom. This paper that was published last year in Nature really shows how soil diversity, the microbial diversity in the soil just is so much greater than other components in the animal kingdom and also the plant kingdom as well. It's interesting how the plant rhizosphere jumps out, and then the sediment, both saline and non-saline, are much greater than the rest. Incredibly diverse. Incredibly diverse, and I think we're still sort of dipping our toes in the science of how much diversity is out there. But does it relate to function? Does it? I mean, there have been many talks that I've been to where people make these inferences, above ground diversity lends itself to below ground diversity. It makes sense and intuitive, but we've never really had that sort of definitive scientific proof to say, yeah, that's the case. Well, there was a group of scientists in Switzerland, work for Agroecosystem, sort of their federal research group there. And they did a really elegant study, published this in 2014 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And what they did is that they created 6 sort of grassland microcosms in a greenhouse setting, and they differed the level of diversity in each of those 6 microcosms. Okay, all right. And then they ran a 24-week trial, and they quantified a number of the biota in each one of those microcosms, and they also measured a really broad suite of different types of functions and services that you'd hope to get from soil. And it was just, I mean, I've never seen anything like this, and they created a few biological indices. So I'll just point upon just a few of the highlights of their study. Now, this first graph is busy, all right, so I'll guide you through it. Here, I'll come over here for a change. All right, on the x-axis, you've got 1 through 6. So 1 is the most diverse community, 6 is the least diverse, all right? And then on the y-axis here, you have actually 8 different parameters here. On the y-axis, you have a unitless variable there that tells you sort of the degree of function that you're getting that. And they're using sort of a ratio from the most diverse system and then increasingly less diverse systems. That's what they're comparing and creating a ratio from that. So we can step right through this. Is what you find is that as the community gets less diverse, well, yeah, there was a corresponding decline in above ground plant diversity, so that kind of gets at that above ground, below ground connection. But then there's these other things that start falling apart. Your capacity to sequester carbon decreases as you become less diverse. Your capacity to cycle nitrogen pretty much stays not different from the most diverse system, but then it drops off as the community gets at its least diverse. Look at phosphorus leaching. Really increases as we lose that diversity. Net productivity declines immediately and then have a little bump up, and then we sort of finish sort of where we started. Litter decomposition stays level up through about the 4th level of diversity and then drops off. N2O emissions peak at the 5th. Nitrogen leaching, not really much of an effect. But this here, I think, really shows it's like, wow, you start messing with the diversity, you're going to affect these different functions. So they create this graph, functionality on one hand, relative biodiversity on the other. And it gives this positive relationship we've been looking for. And to their credit, they didn't just do the experiment once. They got the results once and thought, oh, this is interesting, let's do it again. So they did twice and it confirmed their results, so they pooled everything together. That's why we have gray and sort of light spots there. Now, what I found most interesting about this study is when they started to drill down to the individual sort of communities within the soil, okay? And here's microbial biomass. We have sort of the same y-axis here, relative function, and then same x-axis, soil community decreasing biodiversity as we get to a higher number. So you see microbial biomass holds its own through about level 4, and then once we get to 5 and 6, where we're really losing our diversity, that really tapers off. But then look what happens to your nematodes, your mycorrhizal fungi, all the fungi together. I mean, the bottom falls out, okay? You might recall about 2-3 slides ago, we talked about phosphorus leaching, how that phosphorus leaching just shot right up as we lost our diversity. Probably has a lot to do with that mycorrhizal colonization right there. It also shows that, to me, on that bottom 2 graphs here, is that measuring bacteria and getting total assessments of microbial biomass may not necessarily be all that informative until the system is really, really not diverse, right? So, okay, a lot of graphs there. You with me? Okay, good. Because now we're going to step up and we're going to go look at the canopy. So we're done with soil PED. We're going to go up in scale, look at the canopy. We're profile. You know what I mean here. I'm going to talk about intercropping. Okay, this is something that's sort of starting to gain some steam here in this area. We've got some farmers that are doing it in North Dakota. Been doing it for a while up in Saskatchewan. I'll share that in a bit. But there's 3 different ways we can do this. There's relay cropping, planting a second crop before the first one is mature. Okay, so you've got, they're in the same place in space, but there's sort of a temporal shift in the diversity there. There's strip cropping, where same time, but now you're planting them in strips. All right, so they're in the same space, same time, but distinctly different location within a row. And then there's the fully mixed, where we're just put them all out there, broadcast seeding, whatever comes up type of thing. So 3 different types. Now it's important, when you talk about intercropping, you really need to understand some of the mechanisms behind why we may be able to gain some efficiencies from it. And so there's one, I'll start with the easy one, and it's not up here, it's competition. We all understand competition. I mean, you plant, get a good cover, you're gonna choke out your weeds, that's sort of a win-loss thing. And we try to do things in a way that sort of tip it towards our favor. But then there's these other things. So there's complementarity, and that often has to do with the architecture of the plant. You're sort of, have different types of plants that have different rooting structures, different profile attributes, or above ground attributes that allow them to sort of take advantage of resources where the other one is not. Does that make sense? There's the resource sharing. So you can think about mycorrhizal fungi, you can think about nitrogen, turnover from legumes and passing that on to other crops. An intercrop system, that would be resource sharing. And then there's facilitation, which is the one that admittedly I don't understand very well, but it's a way for plants when they're mixed to be able to, when they're under stress, they can kind of change their habitat to not only benefit their growth, but the growth of other plants around them. And that facilitation hypothesis is one where it sort of supports the thesis that, if that's how native prairies have been able to stay so diverse, is that they all kind of hunker down and help each other to get through tough times when they're under stress. So these mechanisms here to the right, they really can have a positive effect on improving the efficiencies of our systems, whether it's for light, for nutrients, for water, for combating, insects that you don't want in your crop, weeds as well, all right? The issue is, all right, this is good that it can do this, it can improve our efficiency, but what does it do for yields? All right? Yeah, right. Well, measuring yields in these systems is a little bit tricky, because keep in mind, you're coming through and you're harvesting all things at once, whether it's your peas and canola, or wheat and flax, or what have you. There's all kinds of different options out there. You got to have a way to be able to quantify it. So the way you do that is that you use this, what they call a land equivalency ratio, where you take your yields of the intercrop species, sum them all together, and take that as a ratio of the yield of the crop when grown individually, okay? All right? And if you get a number that's greater than 1, that means that when those crops were mixed together, that means you have an over-yielding result. That's what we're shooting for. We want to over-yield. We want to get more yield of all those different crops than when those crops are planted individually. So Jose Franco, he's a postdoc at our lab. And he did intercropping research for his PhD down at Texas A&M. Just fascinating work. And I, in preparation for this talk, said, Jose, give me some papers, give me some data. And so he gave me some papers, and I extracted out what I could from those papers and categorized the results in either grain, protein, or vegetables. And it kind of shows you the results. And this is, just keep in mind, big star, this is incomplete. It's not a thorough meta-analysis. But it's what I could do in a couple hours, getting ready. You find that, all of those points are above 1. So we are indeed seeing over-yielding by mean, but the variation around those points is really high. So we've got a lot to learn here. But it really does, this approach, intercropping, really seems to be a method where we can sustainably intensify our systems, meaning we can produce more on the same piece of land without degrading the resource. Now, it's been going on for a long time. 3 affiliate tribes have been doing it for, they were doing it 600-700 years ago, right? Yeah. So it's not new. And as I'd mentioned earlier, it's being done here in the Northern Plains. Derek and Tanis Axton. How many of you have heard of this husband-wife team? A few of you. Okay, they've got a few PowerPoints out there on the web. I encourage you to look into them. They're having a lot of success. And I think their success has prompted some discussions here in North Dakota. And we've got a working group that's, I think, going to probably get some efforts on the ground here in the next few years. It's not that nothing has been done in North Dakota from a research setting. Pat Carr did some of this work when he was a postdoc with John Gardner at Carrington, and he carried it on to Dickinson. Published it in the Agronomy Journal. You know, sort of mixed results, but you know, that's 20 years ago. Now we need to take it up to, you know, using our cultural practices today. So, okay, so moving up in scale, crop diversity. I thought, you know, just this is about halfway, so I'd interject a little humor. This is a visual metaphor for a certain crop rotation that you may be familiar with. You know, you can see a two-legged stool. Is it something that's stable? Not really. Okay, yeah, okay. Maybe that wasn't funny. It was funny when I saw it. Anyhow, yeah, so, you know, it's simple, right? That's why we do it. It's, you know, it turns it into sort of a factory. Yeah, I know, there's a lot of complexity. You know, when we go from monocultures where we don't have any diversity, you just need some basic knowledge, simple management, and you kind of, you know, you amp it up a little bit and you get yourself you know, a rotation sequence there. You got a little bit more. But then when you throw everything together and you say, I'm going to have a dynamic cropping system, I'm going to be cropping things based on what the markets say, what the soil water status is, you know, what we had in the location in the previous year, that gets really complex. But complexity lends itself to adaptation in times when things are kind of, you know, all over the map. So we think it's good. There's also a lot of reason to think that we can get a lot more production from it as well. The crop sequence research that Don Tanaka led up in the early 2000s, the crop that led to the crop sequence calculator. Here, what we have is that we've got wheat yield in the third year of a 3-year rotation. Right? And to the left, we have, you can see we have the least diverse systems. You know, we kind of lead up to that third wheat year, often with, you know, other cereal crops, and those yields are not that great. When we put in a break crop, flax or canola, I think it's canola. Yes, it's canola. You get a yield bump, and then when you have the most diversity, you're cropping different crops leading up to that third year, you have the highest yields, all right? Here, that just makes sense. We're taking advantage of synergisms of water availability, nutrient availability, probably, you know, keeping the weeds a little off balance, maybe some other pests as well. Makes sense that we'd have higher production. That's the short term. Now, what about the long term? So, what we have here, again, spring wheat yield. We've got some bulk fields out at the research farm where we've been, you know, some of them go all the way back to 1984. And so we can look at wheat production over a long period of time. That's a great thing about doing long-term research. You can see how things perform when things are really bad, okay? Yeah, that's important. So we've got small grain fallow, we've got continuous wheat, we've got a 3-year continuous crop system, a 5-year system that includes corn and soybeans, and then we have our dynamic system. 2 numbers I want you to look at. First off, it's the mean yield in the dynamic system. It's higher than all the other continuously crop system, and it's equivalent to where we're seeding wheat every other year. And you know, every other year in that fallow system, it has the advantage because of the additional water that's available. But it's doing just as well and better than the continuously crop systems. But more importantly is that when conditions are the worst, the dynamic system performs the best among the continuously crop systems. So it's like, it does well when conditions are the worst. This is important. This is an aspect of what we call resistance to stress, all right? There's some reasons why this is the case, all right? Don Tanaka, he was really big on precipitation use efficiency, and for good reason. You can see how much more efficient the dynamic system is in terms of utilizing precipitation that fell compared to the other systems. We went out and did some sampling 2012 and published this in 2014. I apologize, these are kind of hard to see, but I'll step you through it. That dynamic system in the 5-year system, highest levels of carbon content in the top 4 inches. We did okay on soil bulk density, a little bit lower in the 5-year system compared to the dynamic. Infiltration rates, though not significant. I love the stair-step pattern. We're getting water into the system faster. And also for pH, we're acidifying everything nowadays, and that's a whole different talk. But we seem to be mitigating or lessening the rate of acidification in the dynamic system so that it's pretty much the same as a small grain fallow system where you're applying nitrogen every other year, right? So there's something going on with respect to nutrient use efficiency in the dynamic system that is better, that's minimizing that acidification. Dave Archer, our research leader, also ag economist, looked at the trend lines for returns on these systems. Yeah, and it's, of course, small grain fallow is not something we consider anymore, but the continuous 3-year, not so good when you compare it to the 5-year, and the dynamic system is outranking them at all. And I believe this also includes a 4 to 5 year stand of alfalfa as well. That's what we have at the farm. So yeah, okay, so one more step up. It's 10:11, I got 19 minutes. Landscape diversity, all right? All right, soils differ across landscapes. I know that's really obvious, right? But it just bears repeating. How many of you have gone on to the Web Soil Survey and sort of tracked all the different types of soil on your land? Okay, so either many of you are shy or the majority of you need to go visit with the folks over here at the NRCS. They got amazing tools. They have tools even now that are on your phone. You can go out where you're standing and you can get a description of the soil right there. It's a great tool. I encourage you to look at it because soils are so critically important. When I think about land potential, you really have to start with climate, the topography, and the soils, all right? Because what you get from that is going to dictate what you can do with the land, all right? Or it should anyway, and what outcomes you get from it, all right? So knowing your soil is a great way, is the place where you need to start. This sort of lends itself to, well, if we got different soils, then we need to think about maybe managing them different. As Dave Franson says, it's sort of doing the right thing at the right place at the right time. And when I see about this concept of site-specific management playing out on agricultural landscapes, I kind of see it going a couple of different ways. One way is that you can kind of just go by way of the single enterprise, or you can think about having sort of multifunctional landscapes. All right? So let's look at each one of these here. All right. Single enterprise, doing the right thing at the right place at the right time. Well, here, this is all sort of like precision ag. Variable, vary your seed, the seeding rate, vary your nutrients. Maybe if you're irrigating, you can, if you're going to precision to the water application over different times of the season, you're going to vary your crop protection based on where the problems are the worst. Maybe even going to adjust the amount of residue that is retained or capped on the soil. And it's hugely, effective. This is really good stuff, The focus, though, is pretty much on a single service. And you get really good production from this, no doubt. It's done well. But it can sometimes benefit that at the exclusion of other services that we might be able to get from the landscape. So in contrast, when you think of the multifunction system, here you've got multiple enterprises across the landscape. So you've got all kinds of complex interactions, but now you're looking at all these things, but varying them really across what the inherent properties are. It gets really complex. But there's a high potential for sort of expanding the suite of ecosystem services that you can get from agricultural landscapes. So instead of having it look like this, it might look like something like this, where you do see a slight drop in the production, crop production, but then you're able to sort of address these other needs that ecosystems have that are important for keeping them sustainable and interacting with the larger landscape and environment in a positive way. So let's show you some examples. Well, all right, so how do we get there? All right, well, it could be perennials, possibly, and there's plenty of options here. There may be someday even perennial wheat. We're thinking about maybe putting in a small plot of that, working with the Land Institute down in Kansas. And there's a good reason why we think about perennials being used for multifunctional landscapes, because especially when you look at the soil health, there's all these things that they do, right? Fellow Nebraskan and ARS scientist Alan Franzluber wrote a nice little review paper on this, and he just sort of broke it out and said, yeah, this is what perennials do. This is after a meta-analysis of a number of different papers, and it's pretty clear. There's a lot of good benefits from this. There's also things that we've seen here in North Dakota. You know, I did a study at the RECs we published last year looking at perennial grasses, looked at change over 5 times, and here we're storing a heck of a lot of carbon, at least at 3 of the 5 sites. Hettinger had some drought issues, and Carrington had such high organic matter starting out with that there was no way we were going to move it up. But what I won't show that I found really cool about this study is that it's what didn't change over 5 years. We didn't see increased salinity, and we didn't drop our pH. Our pH held the line. That I thought was pretty cool. Andrea Bashe, she's at University of Nebraska. She did a meta-analysis, and she was focused on the effect of perennials on sort of hydrological variables. All right, here, and so I've just looked at 2 of them, and I've had to redo the X and the Y axis, but he's looking at percent porosity and also percent field capacity. And I'll just point out a few things. Overall, over all of the results, it's a net positive to have perennials within the system. It's going to increase your porosity, it's going to increase your field capacity, but there are places where we can target it, where it's most effective. Now, less than 35 inches, 35 inches is really wet, right? Okay, but that's where they saw the greatest benefit and under drier systems, and also where the soil was a bit sandier. That's where you're going to get your biggest bang for the buck from having perennials in the system. There's nutrient retention here. This is really terrible, I'm sorry, but that top line there, that's continuous cropping, and we're looking at nutrient loss from a field over a course of about 7 years, and that's why that number's up at 350 pounds per, well, 350 kilograms per hectare. Sorry about the units. But as we go to these other lines, you have increasing frequency of perennials within the system, okay? They're, you know, sure, we're applying less nitrogen to the perennials, but they're also just a whole lot more efficient in being able to sop up those nutrients. So they create a really important role. So last point here is that it's not like we have to turn the entire landscape over to perennials to get these benefits. No, it's actually sort of strategically placing them in certain parts of the landscape can have really big impacts. And this is what they call the disproportionate benefit hypothesis, where you don't have to go very far on the x-axis here to yield a big benefit, either for ecosystem services across the landscape or larger socioeconomic concerns. All right. An example. This is tough research to do because you've got to be able to do it on a watershed. I mean, so there's not that many studies, and we need to have more. But there was one that was done in central Iowa, published in 2009. And what they found was that the biggest bang for the buck was just 10% perennial cover within the watershed. Just 10%. And you can see the benefit relative to cropping practices in terms of retaining nutrients, and their focus was on phosphorus and nitrogen and sediment and so forth. But it would have been interesting to see what benefits we would have had to other soil health and so forth. We need more work on this. Okay, so we've sort of been around the horn. You know, we've gone to microbial, and then we've went to the profile or the canopy, and then we went to the bench there, the field, crop diversity, and then we finished up on landscapes. Why does all of this matter? Okay, well, Rocky alluded to some of the things that we have facing us. Yes, right, so UN projections, 9.1 to 9.6 billion people by 2050. Okay, that's going to require probably minimum 70% increase in food production over the next, whenever they publish that, but from now that's 32 years. That's not a lot of time. That's not a lot, and it's also for an expanding population that wants, good quality, high nutrient food. And all of this is going to be done in a context where we're still, very much reliant on fossil fuels to make this happen, and we're dealing with a lot of weird weather, okay? Big challenges ahead. In our region, these things are also playing out. I mean, the models for our region, it's really hard to think about warm and sort of really wet conditions, but the models show that that's what it's going to be like in this region, right? We've seen some conversion of some pretty sensitive lands in the last decade. And those conversions, have led to, I think, a sort of a narrowing of the crop portfolio. I'm from Nebraska originally, and it's starting to look like Nebraska sometimes when I drive down I-94, right? It has its trade-offs. So, when I look at those things, I see in the future there's some challenges ahead. And these are just, these are pretty clear to understand that if we're dealing with the more intense hydrological cycle, changes of land use, narrowing of portfolios, these things could be things that we could be dealing with. And so we have to find ways to literally hold the ground, right? I mean, this is what we have to do. And so, at the lab where we work at, this is kind of our approach. We just sort of, we've got the perennials, we've got the livestock integration with the cover crops, and it's all built upon a foundation of dynamic cropping and no-till. And, maybe someday we'll have some intercropping in there and a few other things as well, right? And these are completely, I think, consistent, Jay. I think they're consistent with your 5 soil health principles. They sort of overlap. Some overlap directly, right? Diversity is one of them. So we need to find ways. So there's a lot of different ways for us to get there, right? Using those principles, there's all kinds of different management approaches, right? Some maybe a little more technical, a little more science-oriented, others that take more of a sort of an ecology or a holistic approach. But the thing is, they all really do have value in particular contexts. And so it's important that we consider them all and not consider them as sort of diametrically opposed or an exclusion of one another, which is, this is the rationale behind me setting this slide up this way, is that I think it's really easy to get caught up in what I call the narrative of the false dichotomy, where, you can only do this, but you can't do that. You can do that, but you can't do this. No, farming agriculture is so diverse that we can look at the best of what these different options have to offer, and we just take bits and parts and we put them together. And it makes sense because farming is so local anyway, all right? What we really want to avoid is a cat fight, right? Over something that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, that false dichotomy. The tastes great, less filling, means nothing if you're really thirsty, right? So it's all about, keeping focused on the big picture. We're all linked together. We have a shared responsibility to create a more sustainable agriculture. That's what we want to do. So that's about all I have to say. I want to thank the sponsors for putting on a great meeting and the opportunity to come and share. I'm very much indebted to our staff. I think Marvin, Robert, wave out. I mean, that whole bit on crop diversity rests on their shoulders and getting the work down at the farm, so thanks to them. I also thank all the scientists that I work with out at the lab, and also the Area 4 SCD for providing the resources for us to do the long-term work that we done since 1984 out at the research farm. Just an addendum, I threw this in this morning. We got a field day coming up, Friends and Neighbors Day. That's July 19th this year, so keep a lookout for that. I'm glad to have you there. And just yesterday, we finally got through all our interesting technical issues, and we now have the new version of the cover crop chart that is up and available for download. So we've sort of expanded our warm season legumes. I think there's 66 crops now, so it's free, available for download. You're welcome to use that. So thanks so much.